The village of Millstone sat nestled at the edge of a vast forest, where the tall trees whispered ancient secrets, and the air was always tinged with the scent of pine. Ethan Walker, a young man known for his quiet demeanor and sharp hunting skills, walked along the dirt path leading home. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the fields. His bow hung over his shoulder, and a small rabbit dangled from his belt, a modest catch, but enough to make dinner worthwhile. As Ethan neared the village, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw her. A figure stumbled out from the edge of the forest, swaying as if the weight of the world pressed down on her. Her movements were slow, hesitant, and unsteady. Ethan froze. The figure was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her skin was pale blue, almost translucent in the fading sunlight, and her hair shimmered like silver threads. She wore a tattered cloak that barely concealed her strange, form-fitting attire, lined with intricate patterns that seemed to faintly pulse with energy. She looked up, her large, bright eyes locking onto Ethan's. Panic flickered in her gaze before she stumbled forward, collapsing onto the dirt path. Without thinking, Ethan rushed to her side, his instincts overriding his caution. "Miss," he said, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. Ethan's eyes darted to the faint scorch marks on her clothing and the small gash on her arm. It was clear she had been through something terrible. She opened her mouth, struggling to speak, and managed to whisper one word: "Help." Ethan hesitated for only a moment. He was no stranger to helping people in need, but this was different. Whoever, or whatever, she was, it was clear she needed him. Slinging his bow across his back, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her body limp and fragile against him. He carried her toward his cabin, keeping an eye on the forest behind him. The woods were unusually quiet, the usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves eerily absent. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, but he pressed on. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to sprinkle the darkening sky. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder and laid the woman on a small cot in the corner of the room. He lit a lantern, casting a warm glow over the space, and grabbed a cloth and bowl of water to clean her wounds. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the faint lines running along her arms and neck, glowing faintly like veins filled with light. Her appearance was undeniably otherworldly, but she didn't seem dangerous. If anything, she looked scared, like a lost soul seeking refuge. Her breathing steadied slightly, though her expression remained tense. Ethan wondered what had brought her here and who, or what, might be chasing her. He thought of the strange marks on her cloak and the terror in her eyes when she'd looked at him. As he dabbed at her wound, her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they locked gazes, and Ethan felt a strange pull, something beyond words. She whispered again, her voice trembling but urgent. "They're coming," she said, her eyes filling with fear. Before Ethan could ask who they were, her strength gave out, and she drifted back into unconsciousness. Ethan stood there, his mind racing. He didn't know what trouble she had brought to his doorstep, but he knew one thing for sure. Ethan paced around his small cabin, his mind racing with questions. The strange woman lay on the cot, her breathing steady but her face pale and exhausted. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most importantly, who were they, the ones she feared so much? He glanced out the small window. The night was calm, but something about it felt wrong. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He turned back to the woman. She needed food and water. Grabbing a small wooden bowl, he poured some clean water from a pitcher and set it by her side. He hesitated, then took a piece of bread from the shelf, placing it next to the bowl. As he worked, he noticed her fingers twitch slightly. Her eyes fluttered open, and she groaned softly. Ethan quickly crouched beside her, speaking in a calm voice. "You're safe here," he said. "I found you near the forest. Do you remember what happened?" She blinked a few times, her bright, otherworldly eyes struggling to focus on him. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and hoarse. "They're hunting me." "Who?" Ethan asked, leaning closer. "Who's after you?" Her gaze darted around the room, as if she expected someone to burst through the door at any moment. "The Dominion," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll destroy everything to find me." Ethan frowned. The word meant nothing to him. "I don't understand," he said. "Who are they? And why are they after you?" She sat up slowly, wincing as she clutched her side. Ethan steadied her with a gentle hand, noticing the faint glow of the lines on her arms again. She took a deep breath before speaking. "They're not from this world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither am I." Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. He had suspected she wasn't human, but hearing it confirmed left him speechless. She continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "They control entire worlds, enslave entire civilizations. I escaped because I couldn't let them use my work for their destruction." "What work?" Ethan asked, his curiosity growing. "I'm a scientist," she admitted, her eyes meeting his. "I created something, a technology it wanted to weaponize. It could liberate worlds, free people from their control. But if they get it, it will mean death for countless innocents." Ethan's brow furrowed. He wasn't sure he understood everything she was saying, but the desperation in her voice was clear. "So you ran," he said. She nodded. "I ran to the only place they wouldn't think to look. Your world. But they found me." Ethan's stomach tightened. "And now they're here." "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll destroy your village if they think I'm hiding here." Ethan stood, his jaw clenched. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Then we'll keep you hidden," he said firmly. "They don't know who I am or what I know. We can outsmart them." Her eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't believe his response. "You'd risk your life for me? For someone you don't even know?" Ethan shrugged. "You needed help. I couldn't just leave you there." For the first time, a faint smile flickered across her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. Just as the moment settled between them, a sound shattered the stillness. A low hum, like the buzz of something mechanical. Ethan froze, his ears straining. The sound was getting closer. "They're here," she whispered, fear flooding her eyes. Ethan grabbed his bow and quiver. "Stay here," he said. "I'll check it out." But as he opened the door, he realized the night was about to become far more dangerous than he had imagined. Ethan stepped outside, his bow gripped tightly in one hand and an arrow in the other. The cool night air greeted him, but it brought no comfort. The strange hum grew louder, filling the silence like a swarm of angry bees. He scanned the tree line, his sharp eyes searching for movement. Then he saw it. A faint, eerie light flickered through the trees, moving closer. It wasn't firelight or a lantern. This was something else, something unnatural. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched low, trying to stay hidden. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed rooted, determined to protect the woman inside. The light drew nearer, and with it came shadows, 3 figures, tall and imposing, moving with mechanical precision. Their armor glinted faintly in the starlight, and their faces were obscured by helmets that gave off an unsettling metallic sheen. Each carried a weapon that glowed faintly at the barrel, humming with energy. Ethan's breath caught. These weren't ordinary men. They weren't even human. He ducked behind a tree, his mind racing. He had no idea how to fight something like this. His bow and arrows felt painfully inadequate against their advanced technology. But he couldn't let them find the woman. He had to buy her time. One of the figures stopped suddenly, its head tilting as if listening. A voice crackled from the helmet, mechanical and cold. "The signal leads here. The fugitive is close." Ethan's grip tightened on his bow. He knew he couldn't take all three of them head-on, but he could at least cause a distraction. Quietly, he notched an arrow, aiming for a tree branch above the nearest figure. With a deep breath, he let it fly. The arrow struck the branch with a loud crack, sending it crashing to the ground. The figures immediately turned toward the sound, their weapons raised and ready. "Scan the area," barked one of them, their voice sharp and commanding. Ethan slipped further into the shadows, using the noise to mask his movements. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, every tree and hidden path. If he could lead them away from the cabin, he might have a chance. The humming sound grew louder as one of the figures activated a device on their wrist. A bright beam of light shot out, scanning the ground for tracks. Ethan cursed under his breath. They were too advanced for his tricks to work for long. He darted between trees, careful to stay out of the light. The figures followed, their movements methodical and relentless. It was like they could smell his fear, closing the distance with every step. Suddenly, Ethan heard a loud crack behind him, a fallen branch he hadn't seen. He froze, his heart pounding as the beam of light swung in his direction. "There," one of them shouted. Ethan had no choice now. He sprinted through the forest, weaving between trees as the sound of pursuit grew louder. The weapons fired behind him, sending bursts of energy that scorched the bark of nearby trees. He dove behind a large rock, panting heavily, his mind scrambling for a plan. Then he remembered something. Near the edge of the forest was an old ravine, a steep drop hidden by dense undergrowth. If he could lead them there, they might fall in or at least be delayed long enough for him to double back to the cabin. Steeling himself, Ethan grabbed a loose stone and hurled it toward another part of the forest. The noise drew their attention, and he took off toward the ravine, hoping his gamble would pay off. The chase continued, the glow of their weapons lighting the dark forest like ghostly lanterns. Ethan's muscles burned, but he didn't stop. For the woman inside his cabin, he had to keep running. Ethan's legs burned as he sprinted toward the ravine, weaving through the trees with every ounce of strength he had. The cold night air stung his lungs, but he couldn't stop now. Behind him, the humming weapons of the pursuers buzzed like angry hornets, firing bursts of energy that singed the bark of nearby trees. He pushed through a dense thicket of bushes, his heart pounding in his ears. Just ahead, he saw the faint outline of the ravine. The drop was steep, a hidden chasm masked by darkness and overgrown foliage. If he could lure them close enough, they might fall, or at least hesitate long enough for him to circle back to the cabin. He reached the edge of the ravine and skidded to a stop, careful not to lose his footing. The ground here was loose, crumbling slightly under his boots. Perfect, he thought. He turned and looked behind him. The eerie glow of their weapons lit the forest in bursts, growing closer with every second. Ethan crouched low, grabbing a handful of small rocks. He tossed one to his right, the sound echoing sharply in the silence. Then he threw another to his left. The figures paused, their helmets scanning in both directions. "Split up," one of them barked in that cold, metallic voice. Two figures moved toward the sounds, leaving one to follow directly toward Ethan. His heart raced as he readied an arrow. He wasn't aiming to kill. He didn't think his wooden arrows could pierce their armor, but he could at least disorient them. As the lone figure stepped closer, Ethan loosed the arrow. It struck the figure's helmet with a loud clang, causing it to stagger slightly. "Hostile detected," it said, its weapon charging with an ominous hum. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and bolted along the edge of the ravine, making sure his footsteps were loud enough to be heard. The figure followed, its heavy boots crunching against the loose soil. Ethan kept moving until he reached a section where the ground was particularly unstable. He stopped abruptly, spinning to face the figure. It raised its weapon, but before it could fire, Ethan grabbed a large branch and swung it with all his strength. The blow struck the weapon, knocking it to the ground. The figure lunged at him, but Ethan sidestepped at the last moment, causing it to lose its balance. The ground beneath the figure gave way, and with a loud crash, it tumbled into the ravine. Ethan didn't wait to see if it survived. He turned and ran back toward the cabin, his mind racing. 1 down, 2 to go. As he neared the cabin, he saw a faint light flickering through the window. His gut tightened. Had they found her? He slowed his pace, approaching cautiously. Peeking through the window, he saw Lorana sitting up on the cot, her glowing lines brighter now, almost pulsing with life. She seemed stronger, her eyes sharp and focused. He slipped inside and locked the door behind him. "They're still out there," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I managed to lead one into the ravine, but 2 more are searching the forest." Lorana nodded, her expression calm despite the danger. "We don't have much time," she said. "I can activate a device to hide my presence, but it will take a few minutes to power up." Ethan frowned. "Won't that draw them here?" She hesitated. "It might, but it's our only chance." Ethan sighed, his mind racing. "Fine. Do it. I'll keep them distracted." Lorana's gaze softened. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Ethan said firmly. "Stay hidden and get that device ready." As she began working, Ethan grabbed his bow and quiver again. He had faced danger before, but nothing like this. Stepping outside, he prepared himself for the next battle. He wasn't going to let them take her, not while he still had breath in his lungs. Ethan stepped out of the cabin, his bow in hand, as the cold night air wrapped around him. The forest was unnervingly silent, broken only by the faint hum of the pursuers' weapons in the distance. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. He moved quietly toward the tree line, his steps cautious and deliberate. He needed to keep the 2 remaining figures away from Lorana while she worked on her device. Ethan didn't know much about advanced technology, but he trusted her desperation. Whatever she was doing, it had to be important. A faint glow caught his attention to the west. One of the figures was methodically scanning the area, its weapon glowing faintly as it swept back and forth. Ethan crouched low, slipping behind a fallen tree. He notched an arrow and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure moved closer, its heavy boots crunching against the forest floor. Ethan knew he couldn't afford a direct confrontation. He needed to outthink them, use the terrain to his advantage. Spotting a cluster of rocks nearby, he picked up a small one and threw it as far as he could to the opposite side of the figure. The sound of the rock hitting the ground was enough to draw its attention. The figure turned sharply, raising its weapon toward the noise. Ethan took the opportunity to slip further into the shadows, putting more distance between himself and the cabin. As the figure moved toward the sound, Ethan circled back and climbed a tree, his movements quick and quiet. From his vantage point, he could see both figures now, their lights cutting through the darkness as they searched. One was closer to the cabin, while the other continued to investigate the false noise. Ethan drew his bow and aimed at a branch directly above the closer figure. He released the arrow, and the branch snapped, crashing to the ground with a loud thud. The figure jumped back, raising its weapon and scanning the area. The distraction gave Ethan enough time to move again, keeping them both chasing shadows. Suddenly, a sharp noise broke through the night. A high-pitched, mechanical beep coming from the cabin. Ethan froze. The sound was faint but distinct, and it was enough to catch the attention of both figures. One of them spoke in that cold, metallic voice. "The signal is coming from the structure." Ethan's stomach dropped. They were heading straight for Lorana. He moved quickly, descending the tree and sprinting toward the cabin. His feet barely touched the ground as adrenaline coursed through him. He could see the glow of their weapons as they approached, their movements faster now, more determined. Ethan reached the cabin just as the first figure closed in. He drew an arrow and fired, aiming for its weapon. The arrow struck true, knocking the glowing device out of its hand. The figure stumbled back, momentarily disarmed. "Over here," Ethan shouted, waving his arms to draw their attention. "You want me? Come and get me." Both figures turned toward him, their focus shifting. Ethan ran again, leading them away from the cabin and deeper into the forest. He darted between trees, his mind racing for a plan. Behind him, the second figure raised its weapon and fired. A burst of energy scorched the ground near Ethan's feet, but he didn't stop. He spotted a narrow ravine ahead, smaller than the one he had used earlier, but just as treacherous. If he could lure them there, he might have a chance. Reaching the edge, Ethan skidded to a halt and turned to face them. Both figures were closing in fast, their weapons humming with deadly energy. Ethan's breath came in short gasps as he notched another arrow. Ethan stood at the edge of the ravine, his bow drawn and his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The two figures advanced steadily, their weapons glowing brighter with each step. The forest seemed to close in around him, the night alive with tension. He released an arrow, aiming for the lead figure's helmet. The arrow struck with a loud clang, causing the figure to pause momentarily. It wasn't enough to stop them, but it bought Ethan a few precious seconds. The second figure raised its weapon, a crackling energy blast surging toward Ethan. He dived to the side just in time, the burst striking the ground and sending up a shower of dirt and leaves. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan glanced at the ravine. The loose soil near the edge gave him an idea. He notched another arrow and aimed low, firing at the ground near the first figure's feet. The soil crumbled slightly, causing the figure to stumble. It regained its balance, but Ethan could see hesitation in its movements now. "Come on," Ethan muttered under his breath, stepping back toward the edge. He needed to draw them closer, just a little more. The lead figure's voice crackled coldly through its helmet. "Surrender the fugitive, and your life will be spared." Ethan smirked, not bothering to answer. He notched another arrow and aimed at the figure's chest. This time, the figure didn't flinch as the arrow bounced harmlessly off its armor. It raised its weapon again, the barrel glowing with deadly energy. But Ethan wasn't aiming to stop them. He was buying time. Behind him, the ravine loomed, its steep walls hidden by shadows. He took another step back, his boots slipping slightly on the loose soil. The figures moved closer, their focus entirely on him now. Suddenly, the ground beneath Ethan's feet gave way. He fell backward, grabbing at a root to stop himself from plunging into the ravine. The figures rushed forward, their heavy steps disturbing the already unstable ground. It was exactly what Ethan had hoped for. The edge of the ravine collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks tumbling down. One of the figures lost its footing entirely, sliding into the darkness below with a mechanical roar. The other stumbled but managed to stay upright, teetering dangerously close to the edge. Ethan pulled himself up, his arms burning from the effort. The remaining figure turned to face him, its helmet tilting as if assessing him. Its weapon hummed with renewed energy, the barrel glowing brighter than ever. Ethan didn't wait for it to fire. He grabbed a handful of dirt and flung it toward the figure's helmet, the particles clinging to its visor and obscuring its vision. It stumbled back, trying to wipe the dirt away, but its footing gave out. The figure fell, tumbling into the ravine with a metallic crash. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His arms and legs felt like lead, and his heart thundered in his chest. He stared at the dark ravine below, listening to the faint hum of the figure's fading energy signatures. But there was no time to rest. Lorana was still in the cabin, and if those two weren't the only ones hunting her, they could already be in danger. Pushing himself to his feet, Ethan stumbled back toward the cabin. His steps were uneven, his body protesting every movement, but his determination kept him going. He reached the clearing just as a faint blue light illuminated the windows. Bursting through the door, he saw Lorana standing by a strange device, her hands working quickly to adjust its glowing panels. The lines on her arms were brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with the device. "It's almost ready," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency in her eyes. "But we might have drawn more attention." Ethan stood by the door, his bow in hand, as Lorana continued to work on the device. The faint hum it emitted grew louder, and the glow of its panels bathed the small cabin in an eerie blue light. Outside, the forest was unnervingly quiet again, but Ethan knew better than to trust the stillness. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice low but tense. "Just a few more minutes," Lorana replied, her hands moving quickly over the device. Sweat beaded on her pale blue skin, and the glowing lines on her arms pulsed faster. "It needs to stabilize, or the signal won't reach my allies." "Allies?" Ethan asked, glancing at her. "You mean there are others like you out there?" She nodded. "A resistance. They've been fighting the Dominion for decades, but we're outnumbered. My technology could turn the tide if I can get it to them." Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't fully understand her world or her war, but he could see the determination in her eyes. She believed in this, and now he did too. A faint noise outside broke his thoughts. It was soft at first, a low hum, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder. Ethan peered out the window and saw faint lights moving through the trees. His heart sank. "They're here," he said grimly. Lorana looked up, her expression tightening. "How many?" Ethan squinted, counting the lights. 3, maybe 4. She bit her lip. "That's a scout team. If they've called for reinforcements, we won't stand a chance." "Then we'll just have to deal with them before that happens," Ethan said firmly. He checked his quiver. "Only a handful of arrows left. You focus on finishing that thing. I'll handle the rest." Lorana hesitated, her bright eyes filled with worry. "Be careful, Ethan." He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I've made it this far, haven't I?" With that, he slipped out of the cabin and into the shadows of the forest. The night was alive now, with the hum of the approaching figures, their lights cutting through the darkness like search beams. Ethan moved silently, keeping low as he positioned himself behind a thick tree trunk. The first figure appeared, its armor gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It scanned the area with a glowing device, its movements slow and methodical. Ethan notched an arrow and drew his bowstring back, aiming carefully. He released the arrow, and it struck the figure's scanning device, shattering it in a burst of sparks. The figure jerked back, startled, and raised its weapon, but Ethan had already moved. He darted between trees, his footsteps light and quick, drawing the others deeper into the forest. Another energy blast lit up the night, striking the ground near him, but he didn't stop. 2 more figures appeared, their weapons humming with deadly energy. Ethan pressed himself against a tree, his mind racing. He needed to split them up, make them vulnerable. He picked up a stone and threw it into the bushes, the sound drawing one of the figures away from the others. Taking a deep breath, Ethan notched another arrow and stepped out of cover. He aimed for the second figure's weapon and fired. The arrow struck, knocking the weapon from its hand. Before it could react, Ethan charged forward, slamming into it with all his strength. The figure stumbled back, crashing into the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The third figure raised its weapon, the barrel glowing ominously. Ethan dived to the side as the blast struck the tree he had been standing behind, splintering it into pieces. He rolled to his feet, panting heavily, and grabbed another arrow. Suddenly, a bright flash lit up the forest behind him. Ethan turned to see the cabin glowing with intense blue light. The device, Lorana must have activated. The figures hesitated, their attention shifting to the cabin. Ethan seized the moment, drawing his bow and firing at the nearest one. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it slowed them down. He ran back toward the cabin, his heart pounding. If the device was working, they might just have a chance, but only if they survived the next few minutes. Ethan burst into the cabin, his chest heaving as he slammed the door behind him. The blue light from the device filled the room, its hum now loud and steady. Lorana stood over it, her hands moving swiftly across its glowing panels. Sweat dripped down her face, but her focus never wavered. "It's almost ready," she shouted over the noise. "The signal is stabilizing." Ethan leaned against the door, catching his breath. "We don't have much time. They're right behind me." As if on cue, a loud crash came from outside. The sound of heavy boots stomping through the underbrush grew louder, and a sharp mechanical voice barked orders. Lorana looked up, her eyes filled with worry. Once the signal is sent, it will take a few minutes for my allies to arrive. We just have to hold them off until then. Ethan nodded, gripping his bow tightly. He glanced at the few arrows he had left, his mind racing for a plan. Barricade the door, he said, moving quickly to shove a wooden table against it. This cabin won't hold for long, but we can make it harder for them to get in. Lorana grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. They'll try to destroy the device if they get inside, she said, her voice trembling. We can't let that happen. We won't, Ethan said firmly. Just stay focused on the signal. I'll handle them. The first blast struck the door, shaking the cabin and sending splinters flying. Ethan notched an arrow and aimed at the window. One of the figures appeared, its helmet glowing faintly in the moonlight. Ethan released the arrow, and it shattered the window, striking the figure's arm. The weapon it held clattered to the ground. They're trying to surround us, Ethan shouted. I'll hold the front. Watch the back. Lorana nodded, her glowing arms pulsing with energy as she returned to the device. Another blast hit the door, this time leaving a scorch mark. The table trembled, but it held. For now. Ethan fired another arrow through the broken window, forcing the advancing figure to duck for cover. He grabbed a chair and propped it against the window frame, creating a makeshift barrier. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let fear take over. A loud crash came from the back of the cabin. Ethan spun around to see the back door splintering under the weight of another attacker. Lorana, move, he shouted, rushing to block the door. The figure burst through just as Ethan reached it. It raised its weapon, but Ethan swung a heavy iron pan he grabbed from the shelf, striking its helmet with a resounding clang. The figure staggered, and Ethan shoved it back out the door, slamming it shut and jamming a wooden plank against it. They're getting more aggressive, Ethan said, his voice tight. How much longer? Just a minute more. Lorana called out. Her hands flew over the device's controls, and the blue light intensified, illuminating the entire cabin. The signal is transmitting. Another blast rocked the cabin, and the front door finally gave way. Two figures stormed in, their weapons glowing ominously. Ethan stood his ground, his bow drawn. Stay away from her, he shouted, releasing an arrow. It struck one figure's weapon, causing it to spark and malfunction. The other lunged at Ethan, but he dodged, grabbing a broken table leg and using it to deflect the attack. Lorana screamed as one of the figures turned toward the device, raising its weapon. Ethan acted without thinking, tackling the attacker and wrestling it to the ground. The figure's armor was cold and unyielding, but Ethan fought with everything he had, slamming the table leg against its helmet until it stopped moving. A sudden, loud pulse filled the air, and the room shook. The device released a bright flash of light, and Lorana shouted, "They're here." Ethan looked up, his body trembling with exhaustion, as the sound of approaching ships filled the night sky. Ethan staggered to his feet, his body aching from the struggle. The sound of approaching ships grew louder, and he could see the faint glow of their lights through the shattered windows. The two remaining attackers hesitated, their helmets tilting toward the sky, as if realizing the tables had turned. Lorana stood by the device, her glowing arms dimming slightly as the transmission ended. She looked at Ethan, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "My allies are here," she said, her voice trembling. "We just have to hold on a little longer." Ethan nodded, gripping the broken table leg tightly. The two Dominion figures moved toward Lorana, their weapons humming with deadly energy. "Not so fast," Ethan growled, stepping in their path. One of the figures fired, the blast narrowly missing Ethan as he ducked and swung the table leg. The crude weapon struck the figure's arm, knocking its aim off. The second figure lunged at Ethan, but he sidestepped and drove the leg into its chest, forcing it back. Behind him, the cabin shook as the sound of a ship landing filled the air. A beam of bright light cut through the darkness, and Ethan turned to see a sleek, silver ship descending just outside. The ship's design was unlike anything he'd ever seen, its surface smooth and reflective, with soft blue lights glowing along its edges. The attackers froze, their weapons lowering as they turned to face the new threat. From the ship, a group of tall, armored figures emerged. Unlike the Dominion soldiers, their armor was elegant with flowing designs and a warm golden glow. Their leader stepped forward, a commanding presence with a weapon that hummed softly in their hands. Lorana's face lit up with relief. "The Resistance," she said, her voice filled with hope. The leader raised their hand, and a calm but firm voice echoed through the cabin. "Stand down, Dominion agents. You are outnumbered." The two Dominion figures hesitated, their glowing weapons flickering as if unsure of their next move. Ethan, still holding his makeshift weapon, stepped back toward Lorana, ready to defend her if needed. One of the Dominion soldiers spoke, their voice metallic and cold. "You cannot win this war. Surrendering her changes nothing." The Resistance leader didn't flinch. "We'll see about that. Leave now or face the consequences." For a moment, the room was tense, the two sides locked in a silent standoff. Then, with a sharp hiss, the Dominion soldiers activated a device on their wrists. A pulse of light surrounded them, and in an instant, they vanished. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "They're gone," he said, his voice shaky. The Resistance leader stepped into the cabin, their golden armor gleaming in the faint light. They looked at Lorana with a nod of respect. "We received your signal. You've done well, Lorana." She smiled weakly, her shoulders sagging in relief. "Thank you for coming. I couldn't have done it without him." She gestured to Ethan. The leader turned to Ethan, their glowing eyes studying him carefully. "You fought bravely," they said. "Few would risk their lives for someone they don't know." Ethan shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She needed help. I couldn't just walk away." The leader nodded. "You've earned our gratitude. If you wish, you are welcome to join us. There's a place for someone like you in the Resistance." Ethan glanced at Lorana, who watched him with a hopeful expression. He thought of his quiet life in the village and the extraordinary events of the past day. He had never imagined leaving Earth, but now, the idea of adventure among the stars didn't seem so far-fetched. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Lorana stepped closer, her voice soft. "Wherever you go, Ethan, you've already made a difference." As the Resistance ship prepared to depart, Ethan stood outside the cabin, watching the sleek vessel rise into the sky. The forest was quiet again, but this time, it felt alive with possibility. Ethan smiled, knowing his life would never be the same.